Thanks for coming today to our regular first weekend talks. And we're talking today about Marina Abramovic, appropriately enough given the surroundings. Unfortunately, Marina can't be with us today. She's got another exhibition opening shortly in New York. So I thought we'd take the opportunity to talk about her as if she was here, or to talk a bit about not only this show, but also about the Serpentine exhibition. So I'm very pleased to have with me today two great speakers. First, Sophie O'Brien, Senior Exhibitions Curator at the Serpentine for many years, and where she's curated many important shows by Rosemary Trockel, Thomas Schutter, Gustav Metzger, as well as some of the pavilions, the architectural projects by Peter Zumthor, Herzog and de Meuron, and Ai Weiwei. Previously, she was at Tate Britain, Sydney Biennale, and many other places, and now striking out on her own soon with new projects. So Sophie's here to talk about Marina's show, 512 Hours, which happened all over summer, as I'm sure you'll all been aware. And to my left, I have Sarah Thornton, who is a writer and sociologist, and was chief contemporary art writer for The Economist, and has written for many other people, including Art Forum, The Guardian, the art newspaper. Her first book, you may be familiar with, 7 Days in the Art World, is now available in 17 languages. And she's following that up with a new book called 33 Artists in 3 Acts, which is here and will be available to buy and be signed by Sarah afterwards if she's kind enough, and features Marina as one of the 33 artists. So I thought I'd just begin with a little bit of context. The show here is called White Space, which this is the white space next to us, which you'll all be able to explore afterwards when we've cleared everything away. And somehow the talk came about because Marina's work in many ways seems to have come full circle 40 years after this piece, which was 1972. And all the work in the show is from the early 70s, from 1971 to 1975. There, she just said it. So Marina's voice there saying, "I love you," it might happen every 5 minutes unless I can get someone to switch it off. And that was one of her very first performative sound environments. We have another work outside in the courtyard. But in some ways, I wanted to ask Sophie how this show might relate to 512 Hours, because part of the idea of white space is it's a sort of invitation to the viewer to come and experience, essentially nothing, the white paper around you and the occasional sort of calming voice. But she said something, Marina said something about wanting to show some of this kind of unseen work before, but then I gather she totally changed tack for the Serpentine and decided to do this quite radical performance. And I wonder if you could just say a bit about how she got to the idea of 512 Hours.
Yeah, of course. I think one of the things that's specific to the Serpentine and the space there is that it's quite a small space, really, when you come down to it, and it's in this park setting. It's a little gem-like space, so it's always the opportunity for a contemporary artist or any artist to think through how they might make something just for it, site-specific in a way. And because also the space is looping, just simply because of the architecture, it's this idea that you can think around an idea in some way. You can lead a story through that space in some way. And I think that the idea of showing a lot of archival material or rethinking through reperformance or anything like that, especially after the artist is present, which was such a huge and important show for her, I think it was less an idea of representing things, but she had the opportunity to make something that came out of all of that. And I think our ability to be quick at new commissions and things like that, which is a strength at Serpentine definitely, and having this view onto the park, and in a way having an audience that can in a way drop in and out, and we get all sorts of audiences all the time that are quite different from other places. So I think all of that added up to her thinking through a new thing, really. But in another way, of course, it's a very old idea, in this space. It's this moment where you're in a kind of a clean and minimal space where she has this quite a sort of abstracted but very close relationship to you. So it's intimate, but it's also kind of so minimal, so abstracted, so sort of spare, which is, I think, quite similar to the way she interacts with, in a lot of ways, with her audience. It's very close, but it's also got at a distance.
Was it a concern that she suddenly changed tack and said, right, well, I'm going to have nothing in the space and I'm not quite sure what it will be? But was it nerve-wracking for her to say, well, it's just going to be me in the space? And did she have any more parameters than that? What did she?
I guess what happened was that we'd been thinking through various options in terms of which works or whether she wanted to have there was always the idea of a new work, how it fitted into the space. I mean, often that North Gallery, which is double height central space, is often the place for some grand gesture with artists because it's just the natural logic of the space. And it could have been that the rooms surrounding were the archival material or re-performances, and that new work was in the central space. And I think at some point she had an epiphany that central space could be the whole thing. And once you have that idea that there's a performance, and she doesn't quite know what it is, but that performance is going to fill the space, it very clearly rules out the other material, I think. I mean, we're pretty agile at dealing with these things, and I think just in terms of how our public programs work and the marathon and various other things, we're kind of very much geared for that, I think. And also, of course, the conversation with Marina had happened for many years with Julia and Hans-Ulrich in terms of inviting her to do something. So it had been a kind of a long path, and they've known each other for such a long time. Yeah. I think we also had confidence in her because of who she is and, everything else. So it's very easy to go down that path with her. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. Well, she's very charismatic, and part of the talk, I've sort of structured it around the idea of her being a public performer and also having a private persona, which is, somehow, I don't know if they're different, but I thought I'd ask you, Sarah, to tell us a little bit about private Marina, because you've interviewed her 3 times, I believe, and for the book, there's a nice passage in which you go to her house, or you're in her kitchen and she makes you gazpacho or something.
Yes, her signature gazpacho. Yes, I mean, it's interesting. One of the things that's interesting to me is that Marina distinguishes between her high-performing self and her low private self. She actually uses those terms, high and low. And when she first brought this up with me, in her home in upstate New York, which interestingly is in the shape of a 5-point star. Miraculously, she did not commission the architect to make a house in the shape of a 5-point star. It is ready-made. She discovered it. And also very interestingly, there is no art on the walls. The prongs are all glass, and so you can look out onto the woods. Which she sees as very important because it's often from nature that she draws like her sense of power and inspiration. So I started querying her, high, low, and, could you elaborate? So it actually, this high-low distinction is very much part of her definition of performance. She defined performance art for me as, quote, a construction in which the artist steps from the low self to the high self in front of the public, and from the ordinary self to a different kind of zone and a higher state of mind. And then when I kind of prodded some more, she conceded that her low self was full of contradictions and things that you're ashamed of. Well, that really pricked my interest, and it was actually kind of hard to pull this out of her. Then I said, ashamed of? And then she said, yes, like beautiful clothes. She says, I've always loved fashion, and in the 1970s, that made you a bad artist, which I thought was really interesting, of course, because, a love of cars and strip bars has never really damaged any male artist credibility. It's really interesting to track the way that, real artists and that whole notion is subject to, subtle and also totally flagrant forms of male bias.
Yes,
go ahead.
Well, no, I was going to say, You talked to her about performing in this high and low self. Did you, I mean, is it, I could ask both of you, but is she visibly different in these two modes? Or did she, because she just finished doing The Artist is Present. You'd come to her in a kind of downtime after a very big, grueling performance. So.
Yeah. When I visited her, she was exhausted and had no idea what she would do next. She did not, the Artist is Present was such an incredible success. It made her like the most famous performance artist in America, if not the world. And she was exceedingly pleased with it. I think she wasn't sure she'd pull it off, and then she did, And she was talking about how she didn't want to repeat it, but she didn't know what she'd do next. And so I think somewhere in here, she actually describes herself as blank.
Yeah.
And so her downtime, I mean, I think probably she fights off signs of weariness in quite remarkable ways when she's performing. And one thing her low self can be is tired, And that was definitely part of what was going on here.
Can you talk a bit to that? Because if you've seen her in, her high self, low self in public and in private, yes. Is it that she switches something on to perform or switches something off? I mean, if she's in a, let's say, a kind of blank state in between, because actually in person she's very chatty and very gregarious and full of jokes and full of life. And then when she's performing, there seems to be something different going on. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things she does is, having the years of experience she has, is she prepares a lot. So what she did know in coming into the Serpentine was what she would need. So in terms of what was organised, in terms of even just having a massage once a week, a Pilates class once a week, staying in a place which was an apartment which had some space where it felt very calm and very peaceful. But she's, incredibly disciplined in terms of that time. She kind of clicks into disciplined mode. I mean, I actually don't know if there's ever a moment where she's not completely disciplined. But at that moment when she's preparing and when she's in it, she's very disciplined. And she was eating a very specific diet. She had very specific times when she'd eat lunch during the performance. She got there at the same time. There was a very clear process and repetition of every element. I think the other side of that, which is, as you were saying, when she's allowing herself to be tired after the performance. She was here just a few weeks ago for another event, and alongside this show, of course.
Yeah.
And she was saying that when she got back to New York, she had lots of meetings immediately. She was ready and rolling, sort of not really taking into account that she'd just done this enormous performance. And then one day she just left her phone in the office and went out for lunch. And then just realised that she couldn't come back, and she just needed to sit still in a place where nobody was talking to her for the next 4 hours. And of course her office went completely crazy and rang, the emergency at hospitals and various other things. And eventually she came back. Okay. But I think at some moment she just says that's it, I'm going to be the tired person and I'm going to just not engage. And I think certainly Star House, which is the house Sarah was talking about, is a place where it's kind of a refuge, where she does go away and she knows she's not doing all of those things. I think that there's a discipline and order to her life, though, that keeps all of this tracking along.
Well, that's interesting, because in your book, she's actually included you have 3 acts, as I mentioned, but you include her in the 3rd act, which is titled Craft. Can you explain why? I mean, we've just heard actually about what her craft is as an artist, but the sort of traditional usage of that word I would not associate normally with Marina. But
well, I think she pays a massive amount of attention to the craft of being a performance artist. And I use craft in a very open way, really, to mean like the whole skill set you might deploy as an artist nowadays, which is quite independent of anything we associate with crafts in the specific sense, like pottery and embroidery, and even in the larger sense, like, how to use acrylic with a fine brush. And I think there's actually a craft to being an artist. 33 Artists in 3 Acts is very much, the argument is that artists nowadays actually don't just make art, but they create myths that give clout to their work. And Marina is a fantastic case study of this. So there's actually a craft to being an artist in this very complex, globalized media landscape that we live in. And you know, our history in the past, of course, didn't have to deal with the media in quite the same way. And I think probably art historians of the present and of contemporary art probably need to include media representations in their analysis of an artist's work. Especially when, with artists like Marina, the artist is so self-conscious about it. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, you were talking about how she prepares, and then, because, I don't know, probably more than anyone, you will have spent a lot of time revisiting the performance at the Serpentine over the summer, and you will have seen how it changed or what actually happened, because I came at the beginning and it was a sense of, you know, an audience with Marina, so there was lots of assembled press and we were all very privileged, and Marina would lead us around the room by hand or tap us on the shoulder and whisper something, and you know, that was an interaction there, but I gather that it really changed and kind of went in different directions, and she added lots of elements to it. Can you talk a bit about how the whole project changed throughout the summer?
I mean, I think the way we'd set up her, a sort of a system for her to play with during the summer. So we had a props cupboard, which was one of the small ears. There's those two small rooms at either side of the Serpentine off the first gallery. One was the filming room where the film crew were located, and the other one was a props cupboard. And we had every prop that she might need. So beds, pillows, blankets, the rice counting tables, the chairs, blindfolds, the noise cancelling earmuffs, all of those things that she could use. And in fact, at the beginning, we didn't know if she'd use any of those things, but they were there for her to use with her team. We'd also prepared a whole team of people that had been trained in a way, something between the sort of the prototype institute training, cleaning the house workshop, various other things with Lindsay Peisinger, who was her collaborator and performer through the summer as well. So there was all of that sort of waiting to be used. And at the very beginning, one of the problems actually that we had was before the performance properly started, with everybody coming in, the public coming in and everybody sort of being equal, we had press events and private views and VIP events, as everybody does. But they weren't really the thing. The thing started itself, whatever that thing was going to be, when she first opened the doors to the public and everybody was equal, could spend as much time as they wanted, and had a freedom to behave the way they wanted to behave, you know, within sort of reasonable kind of limits. And so the press event and the kind of council events and various things we held before were kind of like her thinking through how she might start. So I think those first press moments where she did lead you through, and it really was an audience with Marina, that sort of infused the first few days. But actually after that, she became very much not somebody standing on that platform who we all looked at, and of course she was very visible and was there, but was just in the space. And often people would come in and say, "Where is Marina?" And she'd be in the other room sitting with the noise cancelling headphones on, just with her eyes closed, and she could be there for 4 hours.
Okay.
So she was definitely there and we could see her, but she wasn't necessarily doing something other people weren't doing. She was very, you know, a very sort of equal status to everyone. Of course, she had to navigate the fact that she wanted to do that, but she was also very aware of being herself. As Sarah was saying, that self-consciousness is very much part of what that was. But I think being literally on the same level as everybody else, and literally just sort of wearing a very simple set of clothes that were very similar each day, white and black clothes, and our team were all in black, just simplifying that down so that that nature of her celebrity, artist, public, private personality could sort of play out in this quite simple and constrained environment, I think was actually a really intrinsic part of the performance. So not to, I think some criticism about the show was to do with the fact that there were sort of orders about what one might do, and that she was there and people were following her and looking at her. But I mean, that is the encounter one has with somebody who is doing that, and she's very conscious of it, and that changed every day.
Yeah.
So sometimes she was very aware of it and undertook to respond in some way. Other days she just needed to be, because of course every day she was taking people's, strangers' hands and maybe whispering a few words, having maybe a few conversations. But that intense focus of being present in the space with strangers, I mean, it's a very intense thing. I was there nearly every day myself, and just being the person who was kind of the stage manager for that was incredibly exhausting for me, and I wasn't doing the performance, so I can only imagine.
Well, it's interesting then that how, not only how the performance changed throughout the run, but, you know, there was this criticism at the beginning because a lot of the members of the press were sort of led to believe this would be some sort of cult of the personality of Marina, and she, you know, many conscious decisions around that. She would open the doors every day and close the doors at night, so she was there the full day. But the idea that she was this kind of matronly, overbearing presence actually changed a lot throughout it, and you know, her collaborators and the other people who were working with her sort of took the pressure off in some ways, or dissipated the idea that it was just about her. But I gather, you know, was it the same, because in the way the artist is present was very focused on her, sitting there in the atrium at MoMA, and you had these repeat visitors and, you know, these kind of emotional moments. Was that the same sort of thing? I mean, her video diaries were quite revealing in that she talked about meeting a professor and then a builder and all these different peoples every day, you know, but did they come back? Was there a sort of, what was the flow like of people?
There were, I mean, certainly there was probably about 10 to 12 people who came either regularly, and about 5 who came every day, from the beginning of the end to the end every day. And so definitely they formed a little community themselves, and at the end they're all in touch with each other and things. I mean, those things I think happened at The Artist Is Present as well, as there becomes a community of people who participate. I think because people came for, I mean, I was speaking only last night to somebody, a much younger generation of artists, somebody who works in sort of digital work, and he went and he disliked it so intensely because he felt he was being ordered around, that it was a constrained space, you had to do what you were told, you couldn't move, which was a very different experience. But I mean, I guess what I liked about hearing that is, of course, everybody who went there, what their experience largely was what they brought to it. I mean, because really not very much was happening. You didn't have to follow instructions. It was an open space, and you could put on the blindfold or not. You could sit on the chair or not. So I think that changed a lot. The audience changed over the time as well. There were certainly very long queues at certain moments, and that waiting period, I suppose I should mention that too, because of course the queue was very much part of the work, that you had to wait to go in. And it was all dependent on how long other people spent in there. So the audience changed a lot. Marina's response to them, how the team worked, it was a very organic thing. And I think the way the audiences shifted, she shifted with them. It was a very interesting process to be a part of. In a way, it's hard to have a handle on, actually.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that even now, only, you know, a few weeks after that, we're already into this kind of myth-making territory where what did happen? What did she do? Was she there every day? And, you know, people talk about her in this way. And, I mean, just walking around this show, we've already been talking about it this morning, that there's myths attached to all of these, partly because of the passage of time and this famous piece, Rhythm 5, which involves her lying in this circle of, this 5-pointed star of flames in which she passes out and has to be rescued. And, you know, Joseph Boyce is in the audience. We've already been talking this morning about how there are different accounts of that, or how long it took, or whether her foot caught fire, or, you know, who was really there. And how do you deal, because you deal with a lot of artists in your book because of, let's say, their stature or their position in the art world, who are also very, I don't know whether people build up the myths themselves or whether they just happen. How do you deal with the myth and the real person who you meet?
I think the notion that artists are a victim of myths is a fallacy, and that they are absolutely central to the myth, and the myth could not exist without them. And I think Marina is very aware of the myths, and also wrestling with this larger-than-life persona, and then trying to ground herself, and then dealing with the larger-than-life persona, and feeding the fuel of the larger-than-life persona, and then again grounding herself. And actually, she said, like, interesting things to me, you know, that are kind of come through in the scene. She said, this larger-than-life thing is a dangerous state. Your ego can become an obstacle to your work. If you start believing in your greatness, it is the death of your creativity. But then, you know, like at another moment, she does seem to be kind of like, you know, floating away with, so here we have, you know, I was extremely lucky when I found my purpose at a very early age. Since the day I was born, I didn't want to do anything else. She's talking about being an artist. I had my first show when I was 12. And her conviction, of course, is like a hurricane force wind, you know. It's, and then she brings herself down again. You know you're an artist when you have the urge to create, but that doesn't make you a great artist. Great artists result from the sacrifices that you make to your personal life. And she actually believes that a woman has to be like a man to be a great artist. And then she says, quote, one of the reasons there are fewer women artists than men is because women don't want to sacrifice their main function to reproduce, to have a family and the comforts of everyday life. It's interesting. And I think that is a very generational thing, and actually very much true of her generation.
Well, I was about to say, it really is something which was true for that generation of people. It was, I mean, I think that's, you can see exactly how she gets to that point.
And then, of course, she has used the appellation grandmother of performance art and called herself the which I don't know if you know, she has actually since abandoned because she doesn't like the implication that it's time for her to retire.
But does that scan through your experience with the other artists in the book? That is she an anomaly for being so?
She's very unique, but she's also not an anomaly. I think that the artists with high levels of recognition who have been multi-mediated and the subject of a lot of art criticism, particularly artists who use their own image in the work, or have done tangential projects that bring in their self-image, and self-portraiture is a kind of theme that floats through, even when artists declare that thing that looks like them is not a self-portrait, as Cindy Sherman does. The wrestling and the creation of myth is absolutely integral. And I do think it goes back right to Marcel Duchamp when, he started crafting ideas as art. He also crafted personas. Rose C'est la Vie, his transvestite alter ego, the wanted man posters, like his gambler, all of those personas are absolutely relevant. And I think it's partly when the art shifts from being distilled exactly in the object and becomes part of an idea, it actually rebounds on the artist in a different kind of way. When an artist can declare something art, then that puts a lot of pressure on the authority of the artist. And that's when you need actually more myth to have that godlike power.
That's interesting.
To say something is art.
So rather than it being constrained to male artists with a big ego or artists of a certain stature, it could actually be about the kind of work they make as well that propels them into this arena of myth. So the less tangible it is sometimes, the harder they have to work somehow on.
Well, I think that if you kind of case study like the most famous artists in the world, you generally find self-portraiture, especially in their early careers when they're kind of making their mark. And then they can abandon it almost. Like Koons, did a lot of self-portraiture in the late 80s. The Banality series, there may not have been self-portraits in that body of work. I don't think there were any actual self-portraits, but he advertised the shows in Art Forum, Flash Art, Art News, and one more, by doing these kind of odd publicity photographs of himself with women in bikinis and pigs and things like that. So he was deploying his self-image in that way. And I think if you case study Damien Hirst, there are not a lot of self-portraits in the oeuvre, but there's a lot of media activity going on around the oeuvre. And lots of grimacing Damien's next to sheep and sharks and
Skulls.
and the rest of it. Yeah, exactly. And in the morgue with a decapitated dead guy.
It's a very famous self-portrait. I mean, I wonder whether, Sophie, you've written about Marina in the catalogue for the show. I found interesting this passage in which we're talking about her, challenging herself and being experimental with 512 hours and putting herself, at risk and in a difficult situation. But you talk about it as almost like a permanent state of becoming, which I thought was interesting. And you talk about sort of drifting between celebrity, artist, and individual throughout the performance, and the fact that the performance itself then also kind of gravitated towards art and then theatre or an exhibition. Can you say a bit about that? Is that just the same way in which the whole thing seemed quite freeform, or do you think that, like, you described it quite well, her having almost like different states herself within the boundaries of the show?
Definitely she shifted all the time, and I think that fluidity, it is sort of mirrored the audience, but the audience mirrored her. Those things were very interactive in terms of how it worked. I think that she's, the thing about, I guess, somebody who works in the way that she has, with such a relationship to body art and the self being presented in a very specific way, and that long history that has had very different kind of moments in it, and a shift in, and certainly the media now has a big impact on what that might mean. And certainly our decision not to have any phones or cameras or any of those things in there was very important, because the moment that had clicked over into a big film team and a crew being present, people being able to Instagram things or tweet things inside the space, that would have been completely a different project. And it either needed to be one or the other, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I think the boundary of the exhibition wall itself was pretty important in terms of allowing her to be fluid between all those parts, because I think if we had had all of that media capability, that technology in the space with us all, we would have felt different, and she would have been more constrained to be aware of her celebrity more often. As it was at the end, she was getting very tired. She would sort of take herself off into a corner of the space, sit on the chair, have her eyes closed. She might spend another day really being very active, very interacting with people, inviting them to move around the space a lot more. Of course, she had a lot of celebrity visitors as well, so people would be in the space and they would see various of the people she's worked with in different projects and people she knows from New York, and so that was also a part of it which was linked to her but also just present in the space. So I mean, it was an interesting thing. I think she's the one thing you can say about Marina is she's open to all of these possibilities, and her generosity as an artist to other artists, to an idea of keeping this performance, the idea of performance open and collectible and as a kind of something that public should be interested in, that we should retain and think about as an archive, but also as an active. Obviously her re-performances of other people's work was a very key element to that. But I think that her openness to any idea, so that a Vogue photo shoot and her appearing in something with other artists, presenting other people's work, being present in the space, they're all this kind of fabric of things that are kind of woven together, and she is navigating as somebody who's very astute about it, but is also an individual who's having to navigate these things. And her movement, as Sarah was saying, between these states and having to ground herself and then being and moving away from that groundedness in various ways, both just in terms of being asked to do things, but also deciding to do certain things. It's a very interesting. It has a lot of motion in it, all of that movement, and it did have in the space as well. I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, I was going to ask, was Jay-Z there? Did he turn up? But
I didn't see him, but I missed quite a few people.
I think it was interesting you were saying that in a way that you said that she was constrained by her celebrity, and that's interesting because the whole idea of not having phones or not having recording in the space does actually free up the public somehow to engage better with it. But it also brings me back to these cycle of works that we have here from the freeing series, like Freeing the Body, Freeing the Memory. And I mean, in that way, she was constrained by her situation in Belgrade. You know, she was very much felt trapped by, you know, communist society, her familial heritage, and everything around her seemed to be conspiring against her to do what she wanted to do. It was very much unofficial, this kind of work. It wasn't in the communist, sort of socialist, realist camp. And I just want to sort of digress a moment about what happened after some of these works, or during this period. She went from Belgrade to Edinburgh. She was invited to the Edinburgh Festival with some of her other colleagues, and ended up, after Edinburgh, coming to London. And she tells some very good stories about how she was first working in an architectural office, trained to be a draftswoman, and she was brought in and they said, okay, you know, you start on this project. And I think she spent a good day or so drawing very fine lines on a piece of paper. And at the end of it, they said, well, what are you doing? You know, she said, oh, I'm just preparing the paper for this drawing that I'm going to do. And they said, we have graph paper. And she was like, well, we don't in Belgrade. And she'd sort of made this beautiful sort of meditative artwork, you know. Yeah. And she did various other hilarious things, including being a postwoman.
Which would be great, wouldn't it?
Which would be amazing. And she said she had a shitty uniform, and she used to have to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning. But then, in a way, she wasn't very good at that either, because she said she stopped delivering what she called bad letters, which were essentially bills and the like. So she didn't last...
Making the world a better place.
She didn't last very long as a postwoman. And then she worked in a toy factory. It all gets quite confusing. I mean, did you know that she came to the Lisson Gallery at that time? Oh. She said she was, I think it was an art and language exhibition, and she said she was too nervous to come and speak to Nicholas. But yet she went to the Serpentine around the same time. She said she walked in and asked them for a show. Did you know about that?
I didn't know about that, but she got one, didn't she?
Well, she had to wait 40 years.
She did.
But again, you know, these ideas are riddled with myths and misrememberings, and
I think humour is so much a part of her retelling of those stories, because she loves to entertain on a very basic level. Yeah. She's great company. Yeah. She tells a great story, doesn't she?
She does. So. I was going to ask you, Sarah, that we were sort of talking about, I don't know, almost like these new roles that artists have. I mean, you're saying it goes back to Duchamp, it might go back further, but what I like in your book is the way that you order the chapters even. So Marina comes within the context of a chapter about Andrea Fraser and near to Grayson Perry, and it's almost like, I don't know whether, are you pitting artists against each other? I mean, there are some passages in the book where you're very clearly pitting Jeff Koons and Ai Weiwei in contrast, but where do you, and why do you position Marina in that area?
I think the reader compares and contrasts them. Sometimes I explicitly do, but other times I just set it up. So one of the main contrasts is between Marina Abramovic and Andrea Fraser. Mm-hmm. So Andrea Fraser is a very different kind of performance artist, a much more deconstructive kind of artist. And, you know, we end with Marina, and then we go to Andrea Fraser, and her first quote is, "An artist is a myth." When I ask her, what is an artist? She goes, "An artist is a myth. Most artists internalize the myth in the process of their development and then strive to embody and perform it." Which is actually a very good description of Marina.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so, and there's that kind of relationship between the scenes over and over again. So either the artist is explicitly commenting on, artists are explicitly commenting on other artists, or implicitly. And yes, so I hope that happens over and over again. I mean, Marina is also contrasted with Damien Hirst in this Act 3. And one of the things I love about Marina is that she loathes nihilism. And I think there's a lot of nihilistic art in our midst nowadays. And, you know, as she says here, she loathes art that comes out of drugs and the trash holes of being drunk, you know? And she is a vegetarian teetotaler, you know, and incredibly disciplined and observes a lot of Buddhist practices and things like that. But, you know, I think that I have very low tolerance for art that comes out of the trash holes of being drunk, and there's actually a lot of it around, and we'll see it in a couple of weeks at Frieze, you know, that kind of bad boy painting.
But this, I mean, she was she, you know, in many ways still is she was a bad girl. You know, all of this work is...
Was she bad? I think she was adventurous and daring, and, but she's never slutty, like bad girl, you know, like Tracy Emin. You know, she doesn't go, you know, I think she's kind of oddly good girl. She's more the martyr. I mean, her incredibly beautiful naked body from the 1970s, but it's not, you know, well, it's,
she's got a mask over her head.
It's strangely, despite the boobs and the hippie bush, you know, it's kind of gender neutral.
This is the 1970s.
Which I love. No criticism implied there, I promise you. Yeah, I mean, I actually think that she, one of the differences between her high and her low self is that her high self is often actually a little more gender neutral, even when she's naked. You know, she's doing things that are sometimes manly, daring, you know, defying. I mean, you know, this kind of work is not actually typical of feminist performance art of the time quite. I mean, there are examples. There's Yoko Ono's Cutting piece, and but you know, violence was not so much part of the repertoire. This, for me, is much like Chris Burden's Shoot, you know, actually a kind of more masculine tradition, which
well, indeed,
Marina would probably see herself part of, I think.
Yeah, and I think Rhythm 10, or Rhythm 0, which was the piece in which she allowed the public to interact with her. She stood almost like a sort of mannequin or a dummy in the space, and she had a table full of accoutrements, including feathers and hammers and a loaded pistol. The idea that she would somehow submit herself to this. I mean, I don't know whether we're talking about her as being, you know, this sort of strong character, but is there not also vulnerability in that as well? I feel like letting herself, you know, although in many ways 512 Hours was in a way a sort of expansion of the idea of letting the public do what they want with her. She also seems to me to be vulnerable. I mean, you know, in person, she obviously talks a lot about her work, and, you know, you said, you know, she's unsure and she has these doubts. Do you see that in the performance work as well, the vulnerability? I
mean, I think she often talks about the fact that her performance self is, I mean, she doesn't talk about it as gender neutral, but I think it does inhabit that space, because the way she talks about her private self is as a, I mean, she said this many times, as a body, a female body that she's super nervous about, that she thinks she's too fat, she thinks she's this, she thinks she's that, she can't wear this to the opening, she's super self-conscious, no men will fancy her, you know, stuff like that. And she makes great jokes about that. But the performance self is human body. I have a human body, it will enact certain things, people witness it in a certain way. And in fact, the fact that it's got boobs or not, as you were saying, is kind of a minor point. And in that sense, that is almost her relationship to a feminist performance practice. She happens to have a female body, that's not necessarily of the greatest importance, and that's why I think these works are so much in that territory of more of a human test, an endurance test for sure. Also, she sees everything as a sort of experiment, and I guess all of these are a human undertaking an experiment, and they're all thought of that way, which is, it's a very interesting thing to move in and out of female identity, whether a certain kind of in construction or a kind of movement against that. I mean, there would be many things to say about that. I'm sure many people have written a great deal about that in PhDs and things. But there is something about moving in and out of a female identity, the idea of womanhood, of femininity, all of those things.
Well, in many ways it seems like she had to toughen up quite early on in order to get where she got.
And her relationship with her mother as well would definitely have spoken about that too.
And then, maybe things changed when she started working and partnering with Ulay in sort of mid-70s, because then there was an obvious male-female body relationship and this kind of yin and yang and, all the rest of that. But yet she still managed to sort of come out of that with her own identity intact. And again, it doesn't seem particularly gendered, although, again, she can tell a dirty story like any man I've ever met. So she's obviously got these traits in there.
Yeah, definitely.
Where to go from there? I don't know whether we need to conclude anything, Sarah, from this, but you've met a lot of artists in the preparation of this book. Would you say that there is a sort of a model of a 21st century artist as a kind of egomaniac with ideas above their station, or do you feel like they're all different depending on where they stand? Or
I mean, any artist worth their salt is very distinctive, but I do think that there are themes and clusters of commonalities. And being an egomaniac with ideas above your station is no bad thing, actually. And I think that, the wonderful thing about Marina is that she can go there and she always brings herself back. And, another thing she said to me is failure is healthy for your ego. And that is part of this experimental thing. And I think that, she will put herself in positions to fail, to ground herself, to rehumanize herself. And I think there's a deep humanity in her practice, which is extremely moving for people, which is one of the reasons why she has an audience beyond the borders of the art world. And, so that it is that, I mean, she's yin and yang all by herself, right? She's survived beyond Ulay incredibly well. And so that would be my last thought, I guess.
That's good. Do we have any questions before I do try and wrap it up? Anyone want to ask anything specific from our two panelists? Well, I don't know. Sophie, I think maybe if we do conclude, do you want to read that little passage that you thought of?
Absolutely. I did find something that Marina had said many years ago about an idea for a project that had no props, no construction, no walls built, just a space and herself, and the idea of a radical performance practice. And of course, if you read it in retrospect, it looks like a plan for the Serpentine show, and potentially for things going forward as well. And certainly even for the artist who's present, you can see all of these things come through. She wrote, "The public become like an electric field around me, and then communication is possible because they can project onto me like a mirror, I hope. The thing is that the space has to be charged differently, so you lose this concept of time, and it is really now, here and now, just here and now. There is no beginning and no end. There's no end interrupting the image, so the image continues in your head after you leave." And I think you can see how that would be true of the artist who's present, of the Serpentine, and I'm sure of things going forward where there's this, it's almost, that brings back to that very essential part of performance, which is the experience. There's all this archival material, of course, but the experience of that performance in participating or in witnessing it is so core and key. And in fact, you don't need very many things for that to have been activated in some way. So
brilliant. Well, Oh, yeah, we have one question. Do you want to pass the microphone over? Thanks.
Thank you very much for such a lovely talk. My interest is based on the collective experience of the audience queuing outside of the Serpentine and then evolving as part of the artwork inside of the gallery. I'm interested in this idea of the performer queuing individuals. In relationship, let's make a comparison with Tino Sagal, that he will not structure that experience through time, that the audience have to go through a time experience. Tino kind of let us free in the space, and suddenly we are completely wrapped up into his own performer. Where with Marina, we have a completely different structure, which is based on from my point of view, embedded on a time structure. Can you expand a little bit your knowledge on that relationship between queuing outside and time structure performance?
Fantastic.
Of Marina.
Very good question, because I think one of the things she's always very conscious of is preparation. Preparation for the audience, and of course she's done a project in Manchester where she curated a program of young performance artists and then led the audience in a series of preparation exercises for viewing that work. So the idea of preparing and of allowing time to pass in order for you to be in some receptive mode is very important. Also her own preparation to be able to perform or to activate some space or to be in a mode that is ready to be in that higher self, performance self. And I think that she's inviting us to do the same thing. I don't think she's just thinking that's her I think because we were all performers, we were all observers, we were all witnesses, we were all active, or we could be voyeurs, but we were also seen. I was speaking to somebody last night who was saying that after they'd participated in they'd gone through all of the rooms and done all of the activities for a certain amount of time, they then really enjoyed just watching other people, and that it's so rare to be able to really have a look at somebody and to keep looking, and they can see you looking. And that's, on the tube or somewhere on the street, there's a certain window you have, a very clear time limit for how long you can look at somebody without being weird or stalking them or something. But in the space, you could look as long as you liked at other people, and there was a sense that everybody was looking really intensely at each other. At different moments in different ways. But I think the idea of preparation is a very important one, and all of the exercises are based on her research into Buddhist, the shamans in Brazil that she's worked with, certainly indigenous Australian kind of, not so much necessarily practices, but ways of thinking about time and space, narrative and self, identity, other, and an individual, the collective and the individual. So all of these things have kind of factored into these exercises, but in a way you could participate or not. And certainly the slow walk, you were meant to slow walk 7 times the length of the gallery. Because after 4, suddenly something happens. So she's very aware that there's a duration of each exercise and a duration in preparation for doing those things that leads to a certain state. There's certainly a certain state you're trying to attain, and I think that speaks to all of the sort of practices and the very traditional ideas of spirituality and exercises that lead you to a transformative state. So I think it's very key. I think it's also interesting to think that that's not a very cool thing to talk about. Spirituality and a lot of things that she brings to the table, she doesn't necessarily discuss in those terms, but they're not necessarily uber cool kind of topics of conversation, and you can sort of go into a territory where it sounds much more corny than the experience was. And it was actually quite hard to talk about the performance without going into the corny and the kind of hippy-dippy kind of thing, because the experience itself was quite visceral and quite raw and quite challenging a lot of the time. So it was an interesting territory to sit between language and experience as well, and also because you had the duration. So I think all of those things there was a big kind of swirl of all of those things happening at the same time, along with her being very present. The artist was definitely present.
Great. Any more questions before we wrap up? Well, I just want to say thanks very much to our panelists, Sarah Thornton, whose book you can have signed, even if you want, at the desk afterwards, informally. And thank you also to Sophie. We didn't bring any copies of your book to be signed, but thank you very much for being here, and a little round of applause for our speakers, please. Thank you. Oh.